Good morning from Washington, D.C., and good afternoon or good evening to the global DME for Peace community. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks, the best and most innovative and greatest learning there is in the evaluation field. My name is Jennifer Howell, and I am the Senior Communications Associate for DME for Peace at Search for Common Ground. I'm currently in our DC headquarters, and while Jack is away, I'll be taking over as moderator for this session. So today I am delighted to welcome Peter Woodrow and Diana Chigas, former co-directors of the Reflecting on Peace Practice Project at CDA Collaborative Learning and authors of the book Adding Up to Peace, which helped inspire today's conversation. So many thanks to Peter and Diana, who will be leading our discussion on Adding Up to Peace, the cumulative impacts of peace programming. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A portion. Additionally, I want to draw your attention to the handout section on your GoToWebinar dashboard, where you will find the Peace Progress Factor Tree PDF. We've uploaded this detailed additional information that you'll find as a useful addition to the presentation. And we'll actually discuss this a bit more in the Q&A part of this webinar. So now I'll hand it over to today's guests, Peter and Diana. You're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. This is Peter, and I'm speaking from a small town in Maine, and Diana is speaking from her office at Tufts University in the Boston area, just so you know where we're sitting today. So I'm going to quickly go through a little bit about the where the material that we're presenting comes from and introduce this tool or analytical framework called the Peace Progress Factor Tree, and then turn it over to Diana to talk about some of the implications of those lessons and a little bit more about other things that are in the book that derive from this. Having trouble figuring out what's going up and down here. So the Reflecting on Peace Practice program that Diana and I led for about 10 or 12 years was aimed at improving the understanding of what's effective in peace building and to strengthen strategy development, program design, and monitoring and evaluation to achieve greater impact. So that was the overall aim of the project, and the particular effort that we are going to be talking about today was looking at the cumulative impacts of multiple peace initiatives in a particular conflict zone. So the one purpose of the study was to look at not just single projects, so a lot of evaluation, a lot of efforts to understand impact look only at any particular project. So we're looking at the cumulative impact of lots of different kinds of peace efforts in a particular area. And by conflict zone, sometimes it was a full country, sometimes it was a sub area of the country like Aceh in Indonesia or Mindanao in the Philippines. So we're asking the question about how those multiple different initiatives had a cumulative impact or added up to a broader peace goal. One of the sub-questions within that were what were the linkages between local efforts, which we termed peace writ little, sort of at the micro level, and the larger peace at the societal level within those contexts. So that was one question that we looked at here. See if I can advance the slide. It's not cooperating with me. So the So we, as usual with CDA, those of you who are familiar with CDA's work, we used a case study method. So we did 16 case studies, which I'll describe in where they were in a minute. So we looked at the causes of conflict, main turning points in particularly where in the, turning points towards peace. So what were the key moments in the peace process that were designated as important by people in that context? We looked at the range of peace building efforts that were undertaken, and then asked the question of key informants about, well, why did progress occur, and what were the causes of that improvement in the situation. We look for linkages, either direct or indirect, across levels and sectors, activities and constituencies. So there could be efforts at a local level, at a subnational level, at a national level, and sometimes even international efforts. People were working in different sectors, undertaking very different kinds of activities, and sometimes working with different constituencies, whether those were political entities or religious groups or women or youth or different kinds of efforts. So we're trying to look across all of those and see how were they connected or not connected in the situation. We were also trying to look at, in any particular situation, what was not being worked on. So what were the gaps in peace efforts? Were there key questions that where nobody was really working on that? And in a couple of the cases, progress was not sustained, so that while there had been some improvement in relations or negotiations had opened, in about 4 of the cases, those efforts fell apart. So we asked the question why that was. Though really quickly, here are the cases that we looked at. These are all cases where there was some kind of progress at some point in the conflict. And we were looking generally from about 2007 to 2012 was a period when we were writing these cases. So South Africa, Mozambique, Burundi, Liberia, Northern Ireland, Kosovo, Solomon Islands, Haiti, Guatemala, Tajikistan, Aceh, in Indonesia, Cambodia, and Mindanao, Sri Lanka, Cyprus, and Israel, Palestine. And those last 3 were cases where there had been some progress and then it fell apart, or got sort of stymied or stuck. So those were a little bit different than the others. So the results of all of that was this book called Adding Up to Peace, The Cumulative Impact of Peace Programming, which is available for download on the CDA website, which is indicated there. It's also available in hard copy from Amazon Books on Demand. So if you want a hard copy, you can order it there. I'm only going to talk today about a particular tool, one of the sort of key findings from the case studies. But there's lots of other things in the book that, of course, we're not going to be covering today because it just isn't time to do that. So the tool I'm going to talk about is called the factor tree, and we have dubbed this the peace progress factor tree. So it's a way of looking at how multiple different factors add up to a higher level goal that you're trying to achieve. So this is a systems tool because it looks at how multiple factors work together towards an end. So it has a different purpose than the kind of conflict mapping or sort of systems analysis that we've often used, and those of you who are familiar with some of the RPP, reflecting on peace practice tools, will be familiar with those causal loop diagrams that we often create. So it works in combination with those, but have a different kind of purpose. So the way the factor trees work, it asks what are the factors that add up, that cascade upwards towards a result or an outcome, and you'll see a diagram of that in a minute. And those factors can sometimes be characterizes, well, you need all of the following, A, B, and C, in order to achieve the higher level. Or it could be you could have A and B or C. So there can be either an and or an or in the factor tree. So if all of them are needed, then you would have ands, or if any of them by themselves might lead to the result, there could be ors. So the way those look, this is the basic concept, just a schematic. So you have the larger goal or outcome at the top, then you have a series of key factors that are necessary to achieve that goal. And in this particular model, it posits that you need all of A, B, and C in order to achieve the larger goal. But you'll see under key factor B, you could have either B1 or B2 as a contributing factor to the larger factor B in order to achieve the larger goal. So then you have a series of lower down factors that all contribute towards those high level factors in order to achieve the goal. So what we produced from the case studies was this generic peace progress factor tree. So it identifies some domains of action and persist. So we identified from the cases those domains of action and a series of persistent issues that exist in the conflicts that we're working with. We looked at what people were doing in the context and at how they define progress towards peace in those contexts. So we mapped an early kind of draft of the tree, and then we refined it by multiple rounds of looking at the case studies and refining the factor tree. Now, notice that we call this a generic factor tree. That means that it's not specific to any particular setting. So if you're using the factor tree, it has to be adapted to the context you're working in. That said, we'll go on. So those high level factors, so those in the model here, these would be at the level of the factor A, B, or C. So these are the high level factors that we found were important in progress towards peace. And none of this should be particularly surprising to those of you who are peace practitioners. So first, a sense of security and actual security, so physical and psychological security, acknowledgement of key conflict drivers and commitment to address them, which is largely a leadership function where the society really does say, well, these were the factors that led to the conflict that we're dealing with, and these are the things we need to do in order to move forward on those. Durable political arrangements for handling power. So those come often out of negotiation processes, sometimes writing of new constitutions or other political documents. Good enough governance. There's no such thing as a perfect government out there, but it mostly has to do with a really healthy relationship between government and its citizens. So that's a key factor. Economic fairness and opportunity. This doesn't mean that everybody is prosperous and doing well, but some sense of equity in the economic realm. That it's not that one particular group is favored over another in terms of access to resources or opportunities in the economic realm. And then various factors of social cohesion, which are important. At the same time, there were some things that are called global variables that aren't connected to a particular factor, but really affect all of them. And again, these should be fairly familiar to people: horizontal inequalities, sense of grievance, which often can be historical or go back quite a number of years, patterns of inclusion and exclusion, particularly to decision making and but it could be social exclusion as well, or economic exclusion. Mental models and political culture regarding power. So how do people think about how power should be held in the society? And so that goes to a larger question of sort of the social contract and how people understand power and how it's used. So the overall goal at the top of the factor tree was the degree and sustainability of progress towards peace. And those 6 domains that I just went through work to add up to the goal with a lot of sub contributing factors. And here's where the detail of this are in, the details are in the handout that Jennifer mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and that's in the I guess it's in the sidebar. You can click on it. I don't suggest that you take a lot of time to look at it now, but if you want to see some of the detail, it's there. And this, from this slide, you can see why we sent you that PDF, because it's impossible to go through all of this deep detail. But you can see in this model that those 6 high-level factors are at the top, contributing together towards the degree and sustainability of progress towards peace. And then you have the cascading sub-factors that contribute to those, and the global variables at the bottom that contribute to all of that. So just quickly, this is a model, this is an example from Guatemala, where we use the case study material to then code the factor tree to show which areas had there been significant progress, which were in green, areas where there was some progress but still work to be done in blue, and then important issues that are unresolved in red. And by doing this kind of analysis and color coding, you can sort of show very graphically where the gaps in efforts are, where things haven't moved, against then areas where there has been some sense of real progress. So that's just an example. So with that, turn it over to Diana.
And I will try to be quick so we can have some time, there's enough time for questions. And I think as we look at just the, how to use the factor trees and how we found them useful, just a couple of things that the domains are not the same things as sectors. They really were sort of domains and clusters of issues. And I'll go into this in a second around sort of that they're not a substitute. It's not a tool for conflict analysis. What we found, it's really a tool to give a sense of how the cumulative picture and what the sort of larger context and where the progress is, and how one can give a sense of how various peace efforts fit into the larger picture. But it doesn't tell you why there's no progress or why there is progress. It doesn't necessarily depict how the factors interact with each other and sort of what the key drivers are. So that's something you'd need to do with more of a conflict analysis. And a couple of things, Peter, maybe we can just move forward because I know we have not very much time.
Right.
Yeah. So what we've done is use them. They can show progress, sort of, are things stuck, or are they regressing, and provide a basis for discussion about priorities for peace at any point in time. So it's something that we feel like, as we were looking at things and how do you do it with cumulative and a collective efforts, can we assess the current condition of progress, help identify strategic priorities for action, as well as identify any risks or vulnerabilities and gaps. So can use it also to really look at who's working where, and where there is sort of lack of work. As we looked at things in many of the cases, for example, in the governance area, and particularly the specific areas of good enough governance that seem to be important, there seemed to be relatively less work than there was in other areas. And that was sort of interesting to look at in the cases. And then help as a tool also to help a kind of a collective conversation about many agencies who we want to work together to think about how to all of their efforts can add up. Can you advance that, Peter? Maybe. And I think, as I said, it's a tool that is helping, I think, for reflection, for looking at strategy, for looking at the whole picture, but it does need to be used in connection with other kinds of systems tools and systems mapping and conflict analysis tools to really be a basis for thinking about programming. So the combination with other tools is really important, and particularly looking at stakeholder analysis as well. So a couple of just big findings, and I'll sort of do some headlines and then go to questions. The things we found is that I think there's been a lot of conversation about, what's the sequencing for moving towards progress, and we found that progress is not linear and there is no one sequence. There's no one dominant pattern across the different cases. Though we did have some insights into what helps, but I think the sort of this needs to happen before that varies from context to context. At the same time, I think we found progress among the domains is very linked. And so having a big picture is very helpful for those of us who are often focused on one particular domain. So being able to look across at across the domains, not just where one is working. And in a couple of ways. So progress in one domain can sort of catalyze progress in another because the issues are linked. The issues sort of cut across different domains. Or because some forms of progress in a domain may be symbolic or indicative of communicate a political will or commitment to address certain grievances in other domains, and so can have that kind of ripple effect. The converse is also true. We did find that sort of progress needed to happen in sort of some sort of synchronicity across the different domains, and so if there was too much progress in some domains relative to others over a sustained period of time, that often set the whole process back. And that's partly because different constituencies care about different domains differently. And some progress in one may be required to have progress in the other. And those of you and those of us who worked a lot in social cohesion know that well. We often find that sort of is a lagging, we don't see very much of that, but some social cohesion is necessary to produce progress in other areas, but is also then reinforced by progress in other of the domains. The other piece that we did, and Peter did mention this, is that in all of the cases, there were persistent issues. There were unresolved, unfinished business, and some of the familiar themes around power struggles, structural inequalities and exclusion, rule of law and corruption issues, inequitable access to resources. I think the kinds of things that we are all working with, and they didn't always undermine progress. Obviously, you can't fix everything and deal with everything at the same time. But they do represent sort of vulnerability and can undermine and reverse progress if they're not addressed over time. And we did see that there were certain characteristics of the persistent issues in the cases that made situations much more vulnerable to sort of backward movement. And so the number of persistent issues mattered, but more than that, the density means how many of them were concentrated in one area and then really held one area back as others progressed, and how severe or deep they were, meaning how connected were they to really key drivers and grievances of conflict. And the more dense and the more severe, the more likely they would have a destabilizing effect. And so I think a question, for us generally, as we think about conflict prevention, of whether those of us who are concerned with this should be adopting kind of a precautionary principle. So the factor trees don't necessarily allow you to sort of predict what's going to happen or say, this is really headed in the wrong way, but it does help us identify where some vulnerabilities may be, and perhaps an agenda to think about conflict prevention. Where should we be taking measures to address those factors? And I'll sort of say one concluding thing, and a final thought, is that the factor trees really operate very much at a cumulative or collective impact level and a collective work level. And so, but at the programmatic level, and the book sort of addresses this in much more detail, but at the programmatic level, adding up also requires a lot of attention to linkages between issues, between domains, between agencies at the horizontal level, vertical, between sort of tracks, and between piece writ little and piece writ large, and also attention to for those of us who are outsiders supporting peace processes, the impacts and effects outsiders can have to subvert cumulative impacts. And we found a number of those areas that one can really pay attention to. And I think I'll end there so we can start with some questions, because I know we don't have a whole lot of time.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter and Diana. That was really interesting. Okay, so we will now open up to today's presentation for our questions. A couple of notes about our format for those who are unfamiliar with the Tuesday talks. You can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation if possible. And just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace so that those who are not able to join at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and discussion. Also, I want to say that my apologies in advance if I happen to mispronounce your name. I will try my best. So with everyone sending in their questions, while they're doing that, I'm going to use my moderator's privilege to kind of start us off. My question is, this is my first time being introduced to the factor tree, and it's very fascinating and a great way, I think, to help us keep an overview of a situation when it's so easy to get, for better use of the word, bogged down or wrapped up in all the small details that happen. So when and how would you recommend using the peace progress factor tree with a group or in a workshop in a conflict context?
You want to take that, Diana, or do you want me to take a stab?
Why don't you start and I'll come.
Great. So I think one of a key thing to note here is that it's the people in the situation that have the information in order to make the assessment about where progress is happening and where it's not happening. They may not agree, but the source of your data has to be in the context. And this goes to that issue that Diana was just talking about insider-outsider dynamics. And outsiders might have a perspective, but and that might be an important perspective, particularly if they're people that have been keen observers over a number of years. In a way, they become insiders if they've been hanging around a conflict zone for a while. But really, you do need to depend on the perceptions of people in the context. So this tool could be used in a workshop setting where there was enough goodwill. Obviously, if you've got conflicting parties in the room, it would be hard to do that. But where you've got people that are, let's say, peace practitioners who have some goodwill towards each other and are mutually trying to improve the situation, they can look at this and figure out, well, where has progress been made and where has it not? Sort of in the Guatemala example, for instance, if I can get back to it there, while we use the case material to make this assessment, you could do that with a group of people, and they could take each of the 6 domains and maybe work in small groups and figure out, well, where is progress being made and not in this domain. They could also then add in factors that don't appear in the generic tree that they think are important in their own context, and then code that red, green, or blue in order to get an overview of the situation. And then possibly that could be used as the basis for a conversation about, well, what then are the priorities for work in this particular period? Are there things that are being neglected that we should try to focus on? That kind of conversation.
Yeah, and I'd only add, I think that's important for the strategic conversation, but also is thinking about how different agencies who are working in different things can coordinate and collaborate across different issues, and looking at sort of the from an M&E perspective, thinking about what are potential ripple effects of the kinds of things one would choose to be affecting that would have a bit more systemic effect on the sort of larger progress.
Yeah, and just as a further footnote, it might be an interesting tool for a single donor or a combination of donors to work on together to get that overview about where their funding is going and who they're funding, what kinds of efforts, and where the gaps are.
Thank you so much. Actually, I have other questions, but we have a lot coming in, so I am going to let everyone else have their chance. The first is from Isla Glaser. Sorry about that if I mispronounced that, but it's a clarification question. How is social cohesion defined in this study?
Diane, why don't you take that?
And so I think what we kind of aggregated as we looked at social cohesion, and you can see on the thing that Peter has, and I'm just trying to figure out how to move this, the kinds of things that were mentioned both in the cases and the consultations. So I think we aggregated it into a category of social cohesion, but have not tried to actually define social cohesion. So the things that seem to emerge as important, some sense of a common or connected identity, tolerance, peaceful behavior, sort of leadership message, this is kind of the piece writ large, piece writ little, leadership messages from key actors and institutions, social actors, sort of the levels of fear and anxiety and distrust across groups, and cooperation and dialogue. So those seem to be the elements that seem to be important. A little bit like governance, I think we tried to get the larger factor. And so I think in each context, social cohesion and what all these things look like would need to be really nuanced. If you were going to use the generic tree in a particular context, you'd really need to contextualize it a lot.
Okay, great. I have a raised hand actually from Bob Berg. Bob, if you're still wanting to ask the question yourself, I'm going to unmute you now. Right. Hi, Bob.
Hi. Thank you, CDA, for very stimulating work. I must say, just a little observation, that if I were to create a working coalition to address all these big issues, it would almost look to a government in power as if I was organizing their opposition, because these are really big, important issues. I don't know how we protect ourselves from that, but I would be interested, since you have done some work on this, as to whether you have found cases among your 16 where the peace-building field itself is playing well together, looking at larger issues like this and figuring out kind of how they can, as a field, be most effective.
Well, I would say there's good news and bad news. There were a couple of the cases where the degree of cooperation was fairly good, and those are also some of the cases where the most progress took place. I would say Northern Ireland and South Africa would be the most striking examples of that. Unfortunately, I think those cases were rare, and in a lot of places there was very little sense of shall we say, social cohesion among the peace builders. And that is one of the things that we, in the rest of the book, there's a whole analysis of the degree of cooperation and collaboration among peace builders, and why that does or doesn't occur. There's even a systems analysis of the barriers to cooperation in one of the later chapters of the book, in the section called Challenges in the Peace-Building Field. So I think that the scorecard is relatively poor for cooperation. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. It's not that anybody is particularly knuckleheaded. I think there are sort of structural barriers, as well as issues of competition and the way that donors act in the situation that get in the way. Diana, you want to add? Or
I think the only thing I'd add is in particular progress areas, the sort of playing well together wasn't always explicit cooperation. Sometimes it was sort of people really being aware of what's happening and having a sense of how everybody fit in and kind of working a little bit more in in synergy. So it didn't necessarily have to be sort of an explicit coalition or explicit kind of cooperation there. And so we saw a bit of that as well.
Great, thank you. I have a question from Phil Vernon. Phil says, or asks, any concrete example of where progress in one area became an obstacle to progress in another domain?
Diana, do you remember a specific example?
I'm trying to remember all the cases. I think there's some areas where what we did find a lot were, and it's my area of research right now too, but where I think progress in too much progress without sort of a certain level of progress in another. So for example, looking at issues of governance and corruption, if you sort of look at the degree of corruption. There were several cases in which certain kinds of degrees of corruption and were accepted sort of early on in the progress. Lots of progress was made on the political front, on the security front, and even to some extent on the social cohesion stuff and the economic, but the sort of governance lagged far enough behind that sort of started over time. And I'd say it's over a fairly long period of time, so you don't see it always immediately. Made it very difficult then to move forward beyond a certain point in some of these other issues and address some of the grievances. So it kind of entrenched certain power relationships that then became obstacles to further social cohesion, economic development, and governance. So that's one sort of big area where we've seen it in several of the cases. And I will say I haven't read the cases in a while, so I can't remember other specific examples.
There was one of the earlier cases we did was on Northern Ireland, and that's where some of this notion of how different domains work together came up, and then we kept looking for that in other cases, and there was some early progress on issues of equity in housing and in labor. Hiring and those kinds of things, and that seemed to be able to pull things forward. But there were other lagging factors that then meant that progress was delayed. And I'm not remembering right off the top of my head what those lagging factors were, but there was the contrast between those where there was clearly some commitment to more equity that enabled some of the process to move forward. But then over time, where things then slowed down, then the difficulties arose again, and where we now see Northern Ireland is fairly peaceful, but there's kind of a complete stasis when it comes to governance.
Thank you. In an attempt to try to get to everyone's question during our time limit, I'm going to sort of combine two. And my first one is a question from Cecilia Dene about how your data was collected, and then follow up with that from Joan Marshall Massey about how were you able to ensure the factor tree doesn't become subjective?
Well, the data question So we use a case study method, and or I think 90% of the raw cases are available on the CDA website, where you can also download the book itself. And the methodology of the case studies and how we analyze them is described in the book. So there's a full chapter just on that topic. So we use it's not a, why am I blocking? The kind of data is qualitative data. So we do a series of interviews, often somewhere between 30 and 50 interviews with key informants across a wide range of different perspectives in the situation, usually a combination of many insiders and then a few outsiders in order to get their perspectives on where progress was made and not in the situation, and what their explanation of that that progress or lack thereof came from. And then that information from all those interviews is aggregated and put into a coherent case study. So Diane, you want to take the second piece?
Yeah, and then so I think in developing the factor trees, we looked at patterns across the different cases and looked at sort of what things came up across the different cases, and then tested it in a lot of consultations, so bringing it out of the case studies into other people's experience, and tested it with people. I think if on the subjectivity and sort of the factor tree not being subjective in the application, I think one would really need to go into context and have a discussion about sort of what kinds of things, what kinds of information and data actually would be really, would you need to collect to understand whether there is a durable political arrangement or any of these other factors. So I think there's a discussion to be had if you're actually using it. To reflect, you can use it as a reflective, kind of a group reflective, qualitative reflection in terms of strategic planning. But if you're really using it to say, all right, let's see if we can collect data on this, a discussion would be had on what are some of the indicators you'd want to use in each of these areas that would be not totally subjective indicators.
Right, and but I think it's also important to note that this is a subjective exercise in a way, and you can guard against that by making sure that you're getting multiple perspectives, so that you're not depending on any single individual's assessment, but you're trying to get a sense from multiple people of where they see progress and not, and what's the source of their of that sense, which isn't data in the hard science way, in a hard science sense, but is important data because how people feel about a situation is important. So feelings matter. So their perceptions of fairness or progress or lack thereof, or whether government is corrupt or not, and those are important factors. So I wouldn't discount the subjectivity just because it's subjective. I think we've got a bias towards objectivity, and then we try to develop measures for getting an objective measure, but those don't always tell the full picture.
All right, thank you very much. I have one more question. Nicholas Oatley is going to ask themselves. I'm going to unmute you, Nicholas, in our last few minutes of the webinar today. Hi, Nicholas. Nicholas?
Nice to see all the great work that you've done over the 12 years to come together in this work. Question I had relates to something, Peter, that you referred to earlier, and it's about the extent to which you've been able to influence the policy agenda. And you talked about donors, and perhaps they could use this as a sort of framework to be thinking about where they place their funding and think about the approach to take in particular context. I mean, it seems to me that you've set out a pretty, good framework that I think resonates with all of us that's worked in peace building. And I'm just sort of wondering to what extent you've been able to work with donors, other policymakers in particular context to help shape their thinking to make sure that they are addressing all of these key domains in order to achieve a kind of sustainable peace.
Well, that would be lovely. If somebody had the funding to send me or Diana or both of us or other key allies around to talk to donors about all of this, that would be great. But we don't have that funding. So we sort of got to the finish line of getting the book out and then haven't had the resources to follow up on that with key audiences like donors. Some donors have seen it, and obviously the donors that helped fund the project have been sent the book, but we haven't had any opportunity really to sit down with them or to work with them directly. So if anybody has any ideas about how to organize that, then that would be wonderful.
So you have, Peter, done a little bit of work on integrating it into a kind of a collective impact framework and working with people on that, right?
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, and my apologies for the questions that we didn't get to. We have a few more great ones from Sarah Bolger and Soledad Munez surrounding development indicators and monitoring frameworks and specifics around the interviews that you conducted. I will make sure to get these questions to Peter and Diana, and hopefully we can get some answers to you in the comments section of when we post the recording of this webinar. So thank you for your patience about that, and thank you for the wonderful, really great discussion and really great participation from everyone. It's always nice when you have too many questions to have answered. So thank you everyone for joining this edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. The recording will be posted online on the M&E Thursday Talk discussion page later today so that you are able to return to it and share it with your colleagues. We'll also make sure to post the Factor Tree PDF and links to Peter and Diana's book, Adding Up to Peace, for easy access on that page, and also the remaining questions. Also, please feel free to continue this discussion online, as we said, in the comments section. As for our next M&E Thursday talk, we'll be back on the 5th of December, where we'll be talking with Peace Tech Lab about their work around hate speech and social media monitoring. So follow our social media and register on our website to receive updates on how and when to register for this upcoming webinar. And most of all, I wanted to thank Peter and Diana for the wonderful presentation today. And thank you all for joining. I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your work week, and I look forward to hearing from you next time.
Great, thanks everybody.
Thanks so much.